Bible difficulties, Arndt supports DeHaan by stating, quote, "It must be remembered that a deviation from the literal sense is not justified unless Scripture clearly prescribes such a course," unquote. And on page 9 in a book entitled "The Bible Has the Answer," apologists Morris and Clark add icing to the cake by stating, quote, "The best rule to follow is to take the Bible literally unless the context requires and clearly requires a symbolic meaning," unquote. So all of these men agree on a crucial point. The Bible should always be taken literally unless there is an unmistakably correct reason for doing otherwise. With that, I am in wholehearted agreement. I only wish fundamentalists would follow their own advice. I've always operated on the principle that the Bible means what it says, and it says what it means. If its authors had meant to say something else, they would have written something else. Unbeknownst to many, however, is that the fact that this view being expounded by these fundamentalist writers is ignored by apologists in general whenever the situation warrants. Where is it ignored? Well, the 3rd chapter of Genesis, almost at the beginning of the Bible, provides a good starter. If you'll recall the story of Adam and Eve, the woman told the serpent that they couldn't eat the forbidden fruit because, quote, "God says we must not eat it or we will die," unquote. And the serpent said, "That's a lie. You will not die." So the question becomes, after eating it, did they or didn't they die? No, they didn't die. In fact, Adam lived to be one of the oldest men in the Bible. Genesis 5:5 says he lived to be 930 years old. Now, if we take Genesis literally, they should have died. To extricate themselves from this embarrassing predicament, biblicist will say, well, they died spiritually. But that's not what the book says. It says they would die. Nothing is said about a spiritual death. Remember, we're operating on the principle that the Bible means what it says and says what it means. Fundamentalists love to talk about a literal interpretation until they begin to feel the pinch, at which time they immediately opt for a figurative analysis. They scrap the literal approach whenever necessary, while simultaneously denouncing Christian liberals for doing the same thing. Apologists Morris and Clark try to justify leaving the literal interpretation in certain instances by saying, quote, "Whenever a scriptural writer uses figurative or poetic language, he makes this evident in the context. And the truth intended to be conveyed by the figure is likewise evident in the context," unquote. But these rules have little to do with reality, because the Bible does not clearly show it is speaking figuratively in many instances. Morris and Clark are actually trying to create an excuse for leaving the literal approach whenever it puts biblicist in a bind. While discussing biblical interpretation, James Sire, in his book entitled Scripture Twisting, provides some additional rules that are routinely violated by his fellow biblicists. Misreading rule number 4 says the simplest error is the failure to consider the immediate context of the verse or passage in question. To say that this rule is violated on a routine basis by the Bible supporters, especially when it comes to interpreting Old Testament passages and their messianic reliability, is to utter an understatement of the first magnitude. Fundamentalists ignore this maxim en masse. They allege that many Old Testament passages pertain to Jesus, when one need only look at the context to see that they clearly do not. We'll cover this much more extensively in a later program. Another law on page 82 in Sire's book is entitled Misreading Rule Number 2, which says, quote, "Some parts of the Bible are obscure, puzzling to say the least. Scholars simply don't know what is being said or referred to. Sometimes, even when we considered all the evidence seemingly available in Scripture, there is not enough to satisfy our curiosity or to draw solid conclusions. The inadequacy of scriptural data, however, has not kept people from speculating," unquote. Boy, how true that is. In many instances, they have let their imaginations run wild. To illustrate his point, Sire makes reference to the giants roaming the earth that are discussed in the 6th chapter of Genesis. Who these giants are is anyone's guess. And he notes that speculation has run amok in this regard. Other examples of imaginations running wild are also available. Nowhere, for example, is the tendency of apologists to go through the Bible and interpret verses with reckless abandon more obvious than in the books of Daniel and Revelation. Here they have speculated no end. The sky has been the limit. One scholar once said that he had 4 different interpretations of the book of Revelations, each consistent from beginning to end, and not one of them